Greetings, everyone, and welcome to ION Africa. My name is Awasar. I'm Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center, and ION Africa is our weekly seminary series. We're very delighted today to have Dr. Dannica Fleuss as our guest speaker. Before I pass it on to her, a brief introduction. So Dr. Dannica Fleuss is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Future Media, Democracy and Society at Dublin City University, Ireland, and a research associate at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Government at the University of Canberra, Australia. At Dublin City University, Dannica is involved in two research projects that address the potential of democratic deliberation to counteract or mitigate the impact of climate change. She has been a research fellow and a senior lecturer in political theory, empirical political science, and political philosophy at Helmut Schmidt University. From 2016 to 2022, and Heidelberg University from 2014 to 2017. She is a co-convenor of the UK Political Studies Association's Participatory and Deliberative Democracy Specialist Group, a co-convenor of the German Political Science Association's Teaching and Learning Specialist Group, and an associate editor of the interdisciplinary journal Democratic Theory. She was a visiting research fellow and lecturer at the University of Canberra, Westminster University, the University of Dar, Salaam, Technical University of Kenya, and the University of Nairobi. Dannica holds an MA in philosophy and political science and a PhD in political science. Her research focuses on theories of democratic legitimacy, theoretical and empirical studies of deliberative democracy, environmental politics, and approaches aiming at decolonizing, indigenizing democratic theory. It was published in Political Studies, Policy and Internet, Democratic Theory or Political Geography, and in her monograph, Radical Proceduralism, Democracy from Philosophical Principle to Political Institutions. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Fleuss. I pass the floor to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for the kind invite. I'm very excited to talk to you today. And yeah, I'm very grateful that you're having me for this exchange. I'm going to talk about climate justice through African eyes and about climate change vulnerability that I consider as a fruitful dimension for intersectionality studies. But before I get started with this, I would like to give some brief disclaimers. First of all, the findings and the illustrations from Africa, so from sub-Saharan Africa more specifically, that I'm drawing from are definitely eclectic. Secondly, I'm not African. I'm not an expert in regional or cultural studies. As Avasar already said, I was a visiting researcher, visiting professor, visiting lecturer for a while in East Africa, and I think I merely learned to see myself as a stranger and aspired to learn by changing perspectives and seeing the other side, and then tried to develop an understanding of lived experiences of people who grew up in culturally, economically, and politically very, very different environments. So for this talk, I'm hugely indebted to great colleagues, artists, friends, students, interviews from the time that I spent in East Africa, especially at the University of Nairobi, the Technical University of Kenya, and the University of Dar, Salaam. And in this talk, I basically tried to develop some tools to understand and convey lived experience and to integrate them into political theorizing. So now to get to climate justice and climate change debates. Why are discussions about climate justice that we should justice is, according to John Rawls, the first virtue of the social institutions, and nevertheless, explicit debates about justice are frequently marginalized against the economic and strategic political considerations. So Gardner argues that is puzzling, dominated by prudential and economic terms. Typically, policies are said to be good or bad for us, where the us is either humanity.
We're not hearing you very much. There are echoes, it seems, if you're moving.
Okay. Sorry?
Yeah, it seems like if you move a little bit left, we don't hear you very well.
So I'm trying to not move left.
Yes. Yes, now it's better.
All right. So why are these important conversations to have? The first point would be that debates about climate change are frequently driven by economic and strategic political considerations. And in many cases, what is good for us, and this us is only very vaguely defined. What does it mean that policies to counteract climate change are supposed to be good for us, especially considering the fact that it is a global issue? Furthermore, contemporary public discourses that I will dig into highlight the need for consequential political action. But if we do not highlight the harms and inequities inflicted upon the poor, current people more generally, future generations especially, and the rest of nature as well, then we are missing the central reasons for action and obscuring what is at stake. So I think this provides some of the backgrounds why I think discussions about climate justice are important vis-a-vis the current climate emergency. So to give you a brief overview of the talk and core questions, I'm briefly going to say something about the context about climate justice, climate change discourses, the contemporary climate change or climate emergency, and intersectional thought to provide the backdrop for my talk. And then we'll more specifically outline 3 core claims. The first being that we need a methodological turn in political theory to account for the value of lived experiences and avoid Western or global North driven biases in theorizing and thinking about theoretical or normative issues. The second claim is that climate justice should be reconceptualized in a context-sensitive manner that it also accounts for multifarious intersecting oppressions. So this includes that I wish to develop a bottom-up approach to conceptualize climate justice, and I will dig into illustrative findings, into artworks, narratives, interviews, and so on from sub-Saharan African countries to try to see climate justice through African eyes. And lastly, I will argue or propose to see climate change vulnerability as a fruitful dimension for contemporary intersectionality studies or social research, and wrap up my preliminary findings so far. So, and I will particularly focus on this part that I just highlighted, so on this reconceptualization of climate justice that I will pursue in the following minutes. So to give you some context, the climate emergency, contemporary climate change discourses, and intersectional thought. I think at least since the agreement, the COP agreement in Paris in 2015, climate change is widely accepted as a fact, at least in mainstream discourses, or at the very least, we're currently working on expansive discursive analysis in our research projects in European mainstream discourses. Striking, however, against this backdrop is the lack of consequential action that would actually, enable us to meet the goals set by COP21 or also by the IPCC. So one crucial point that we should probably bear in mind against this backdrop is that consequential political action is definitely not in everybody's interests. So on the one hand, corporate actors, lobbyists, and politicians certainly have vested interests, and misperception generating strategies in public communication are exploited or applied by those actors. Secondly, there's skepticism also among the general public, asking, for example, who actually carries the burden of these radical or consequential action to counteract climate change and its consequences. And this, for example, also resonates in fairness considerations among European citizens. And this is one of the research projects that I'm currently working on, where we conducted deliberative experiments and focus groups, and where this really was a vibrant issue also among European citizens and not only at the global scale. So discourses matter for political action, and that's why I want to say a couple of words just about climate change discourses in general. Discourses provide the informational basis and the frames for interpreting political and societal developments, and with this, for acting upon them on behalf of citizens, on behalf of politicians. And what may seem like an advantage or progress, and that is the decline of public, straightforward climate change denial, at least, for example, in the European context, is at a closer look actually way more complex. So we can see an increase in more subtle or sophisticated delay discourses that essentially don't deny climate change, but nevertheless try to delay consequential political action with diverse strategies. And I think from a global perspective, or from a perspective that considers matters of global justice, two types of delay discourses are particularly interesting or revealing. I highlighted them here. So one of them would be discourses, or one set of them would be discourses that redirect responsibility. For example, the free rider discourse that basically argues that reducing emissions is going to weaken us, and that others have no real intention to reduce their CO2 emissions and so on, and that at the end of the day, we, whoever that may be, will be, carry all the costs. The similar discourse is whataboutism. That's the label that Lamb uses here. And it's basically, so also a measure to redirect responsibility to others who allegedly have a higher carbon footprint and are more responsible for the climate emergency, and more, who carry more responsibility for acting upon them and taking maybe also radical measures that are have economical impacts. Another point would be appeals to social justice. I already mentioned them, and there the argument often goes climate justice, climate action will generate large costs, and this will particularly have impacts on the working class, on hardworking, ordinary citizens, and so on. And against this backdrop, they emphasize the downsides of radical political action on climate change, or more consequential political action on climate change. And I think both of these discourses will be interesting when we have a look at climate justice also at a global scale. So, as I already said, the climate emergency is, I think, that's so far undisputed a global issue. It threatens future generations and the future of the planet. So in the IPCC statements, for example, from this year, every increment of global warming will intensify multiple and concurrent hazards. Adaptation options that are feasible and effective today will become constrained and less effective with increasing global warming. And the girl that you can see on the right, so Greta Thunberg, most of you will somehow know her from watching TV or so, argued, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are at the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?" So Greta Thunberg's speech already indicated that we, so the Fridays for Future movement, students striking to protest and to instigate more consequential political action, she already indicates that the burdens of climate change are unequally distributed when she says, well, I'm one of the lucky ones, or we are among the lucky ones. This obviously leads to the follow-up question, who carries the burden? And a particularly graphic example referring to subsistence farming and food production is this quote from Mary Robinson's fieldwork for her manifesto on climate change that gives Constance, a woman from Uganda, a voice. The women in my community have never had time to rest, but now with climate change, their life is even worse. There's less water now, so I have to go more frequently to the well. Sometimes when the well is low, I wake up at midnight to fetch water because the line during the day is too low. Sometimes I go to my field to notice that someone has stolen my crops. I know that my neighbors must be desperate, very hungry if they are forced to steal. Domestic violence is on the rise. Women have to travel farther and farther to fetch water and firewood. Some men do not understand and beat their wives if they spend too much time away from their homes. So we have here future generations that Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for Future movement point to. We have communities in so-called developing countries in the global south. I actually personally don't like the term developing countries because for me it presupposes that there's like one unique goal that you're supposed to develop to. I kind of reject this notion. But it also particularly affects, or especially affects, individuals and communities with a low economic status and women who are in many so-called developing countries responsible for food security and subsistence farming carry a lot of the burden, as here mentioned by the quotes listed above and what I said before already point out the extent to which we suffer from climate change depends to a large extent on different factors that are relevant to intersections of their age, race, sex or gender, their economic status, ethnicity or nationality, and in many cases simply their location on the globe. And what is more, those who are likely to suffer most from climate change associated with the impacts these impacts are those who are least responsible for man-made climate change. The Industrial Revolution, high consumption lifestyles, etc., that are associated with high CO2 emissions are largely products of the global north. And what is more, and I think you can see this here in the visual that, or in the chart that displays greenhouse gas emissions on the right, the legacy of colonialism and post-colonialism left those countries in a condition where climate change adaptation and mitigation that is expensive is even harder to achieve than in industrialized and wealthy societies. So we can see on the one hand, those people who are suffering the most are actually those who are least responsible for high levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So much for the context, and I'm now getting to the first claim that I wish to defend throughout this talk. So the first claim is that we need a methodological turn in theorizing and conceptualizing climate justice. Classical accounts of environmental justice are concerned with the fairness or unfairness regarding relationships between humans as carried out through the medium of the national environment. Climate change is now likely to increase these existing inequalities and injustices and has particularly strong impacts on already disadvantaged communities. And the concept and theorizing about climate justice in contrast to environmental justice emerged predominantly vis-a-vis the so-called climate emergency. What is interesting now is climate ethics, exemplary ethics or moral philosophy perspectives that are applied in theories of climate justice, not in all of them, but in the overarching or overwhelming amount of conceptualizations. Accounts such as right-based accounts, utilitarianism, or presentism. So long story short, there are actually methodological, conceptual frameworks and moral philosophy frameworks that are usually developed by global north, or have been developed in global north scholarship and discourses, and don't refer to, well, let's say homegrown or context-sensitive understandings of climate justice, of justice and its implications for theorizing and understanding climate justice. So against this backdrop, I have a couple of methodological concerns when it comes to taking existing abstract philosophical notions of justice as a point of departure and develop a top-down approach and apply these abstract notions merely to yet another context. So for once, and I already mentioned this, these concepts are usually referring to established and predominantly Western notions, and take them as a point of departure. They consider indigenous perspectives about the relationship between human and non-human nature, and also about the nature of justice, only to an insufficient amount. So generally speaking, environmental scholars pay a lot of attention to indigenous communities, their needs and understandings, and so on. But when it comes to climate justice, interestingly, theorizing is still sort of in the beginning of this process to also do justice to indigenous understandings of those issues, particularly of the relationship between human and non-human nature, and of understandings of justice. And this leads to potentially biased perspectives on climate justice as a global issue. So my suggestion, aligning also with an assessment of Schlossberg, at least broad assessment, is to ground assessments and conceptualizations of climate justice bottom up. Schlossberg particularly refers to social movements who have been important for environmental justice, who articulate their demands and visions of climate justice. So to give you a very brief idea of the backdrop and the conceptual and theoretical backdrop that is important for me here. So I am developing and proposing this bottom-up approach also with a different focal point in my recent monograph. And I argue that generally democratic and inclusive politics and political theory that also does justice to indigenous communities and marginalized groups and can avoid biased perspectives need to start out from a fairly simple normative conviction, and that would be to avoid paternalism at all costs. So political theorists' paternalism often originated in argumentations that established universal notions of what is, that used established and allegedly universal notions of what is ethically, morally, or politically right, correct, or just. And to avoid paternalism in contemporary pluralistic societies and from a global perspective, we need to account for values, ideals, and preferences, and also for interests of individuals and communities at a global scale, and avoid all references to universal notions of moral, political rightness and correctness, and base our theories solely on inclusive procedures also when it comes to theorizing. This means that we must democratize and indigenize the process of generating knowledge and generating theories. So I will propose a collaborative approach where I include participants, artists, interviewees to ground my understanding of climate justice. I suppose what we still want and need is to provide an action guiding vision for what should be done, in this case, to develop a constructive, but also context-sensitive and anti-paternalistic understanding of climate justice. So when we take the stance that I'm defending here, we must admit they're proposing concrete visions of what is right, just, or correct, and what climate justice is actually supposed to mean or to be about is beyond the remits of abstract theorizing and political philosophy. So if armchair political philosophy or theorizing would be the only options, I think we would have a serious problem, at least we as political theorists. There would be no non-circular way to propose any account of, any constructive account of what should be done, and theorizing would be of no use in our world. So I looked for an alternative methodological approach and asked the question, how can we get out of the theorist's armchair? And I am essentially in Radical Proceduralism, but also in other work, proposing a methodological turn and ask the question, what is an alternative methodological approach? How can we get out of the theorist's armchair? And in a nutshell, my response is, political theorists must democratize and indigenize epistemic practices such as political theorizing. They must ask citizens or communities and not philosophers or their philosophy colleagues and canonical books and works. Skills. So what I'm proposing at the end of the day is an empirically grounded reconceptualization of climate justice, or at least the first steps to get there. We can imagine grounded normative theory in line with Genevieve Furtje-Thompson's approach, for example, and Ackley et al.'s approach as an approach where you start out from a conceptual framework of climate justice, or a very basic understanding or rudimentary understanding, dig into lived experiences as it manifests in narratives, artworks, or also in dialogues with people, can be various things, and then have a feedback loop to reconceptualize and re-understand climate justice. You can also start the other way around. It's really just a recursive and iterative process of theorizing that aims at grounding on normative conceptualizations in people's experiences and in empirical work. So this has consequences on the one hand in terms of comprehensiveness and epistemic inclusion. So I will try to propose an account that is based on lived experiences and that is inclusive also in terms of formats for expression. So by including art, narratives, and so on, in also conventional theory from African theorists or philosophers. Secondly, a crucial element of this kind of theorizing is recursivity. So grounded normative theory is marked by a commitment to the revision and refinement of normative claims that are developed through a repeated engagement with empirical findings, but also through a repeated engagement, at least that's my proposal, with participants, interviewees, artists with whom I've been collaborating and exchanging to sort of cross-check and refine the account of justice, or climate justice, that I proposed here. Getting to my second claim, climate justice should be reconceptualized bottom-up. That's what I outlined in a context-sensitive manner that accounts for multifarious intersecting oppressions. And here I will outline basically, the core elements or some illustrative findings from mainly from sub-Saharan Africa, from different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So I had a brief recap here, but I think we can basically keep this short. I proposed a methodological term where I consider theorizing as a collaborative project that is grounded in lived experience, and also want to reconceptualize climate justice accordingly. So one crucial question now is how we can convey lived experiences, especially to context strangers, such as myself in the sub-Saharan African context. And I use two basic strategies here. One would be to try to get access to lived experiences via narratives, diverse artistic forms of expressions, paintings, satire, cartoons, sculptures, and so on. And the second would be to draw from reports of affected communities or individuals in interviews and exchanges and in ethnographic fieldwork. So what specifically will I try to do in the next minutes? I will ask two core questions. How can we understand the relationship between the human and the non-human world when we look at this through African or sub-Saharan African eyes? I'm actually a big fan of the hashtag not a country. So try to be a bit more nuanced here, but have to be eclectic nevertheless in this presentation. So how can we understand this relationship between the human and the non-human world through African eyes? And secondly, what are homegrown or maybe alternative notions of justice that are culturally embedded, make sense in those relevant contexts? I'm now getting to some interviews and reports from indigenous researchers and activists when it comes to the first point, namely the relationship between the human and the non-human world. So one is from the Kenyan activist Mathai, and I draw here from her, essentially from her autobiography on Baud, and she writes in trying to explain this linkage so between environment and society, between environment and human beings. I was inspired by a traditional African tool that has 3 legs and a basin to sit on. To me, the 3 legs represent the 3 critical pillars of just and stable societies. The first leg stands for democratic space, where rights are respected, whether they are human rights, women's rights, children's rights, or environmental rights. And the second represents a sustainable and equitable management of resources, while the first then stands for peace that is cultivated in communities and nations. I think here one particularly interesting feature is this emphasis that responsible management of natural resources is one of the core pillars of society and communities. In Oruka's Sage Philosophy and Environmental Ethics, I found 2 elements that I found particularly interesting with regards to the relationship between human and non-human world. So one would be to consider the earth or the world as a family unit in which members have a kind of kinship relationship with one another, and the earth is a commonwealth to all humanity. So particularly this notion of the earth or the world as a unit, as a family unit, is very interesting, and I think also like it's a very good metaphor. And secondly, the following quote: humanity's attitude towards nature should not be that of dominating or possessing nature, but rather that of being in exchange with it. And I will outline at the end of my talk why I think that this is also a particularly important notion when it comes to rethinking climate justice in the global north, or the so-called West. Lastly, in personal conversations with Jeremiah Erdung, but also in many cons in Robinson's manifesto, there's a strong emphasis on context knowledge and the intimate relationship to nature that particularly indigenous women, for example, in rural Kenya and Tanzania have, but also on the power that those women have when it comes to their crucial role for food security, and to the vulnerability that already was displayed in the quote in the quote by Robinson, where she cites Constance, this woman from Uganda, who pointed to the hardship that climate change causes for her, and also to what extent she as a woman became vulnerable in that situation. So one, at least from a Western or global North perspective, particularly graphic example when it comes to a different understanding of the relationship between the human and the non-human world would be, well, a nomadic life as it is displayed by Maasai people in Kenya and Tanzania. Look at my remarks here that the values and norms of the Maasai are related to the forest in one way or other. Among the believed residences of the Black Creator, so God, are the thick and dense forests. Certainly rare endangered species of trees are said to be gods of the Maasai, and doomed are those who dare to be near, let alone cut the particular species of the trees. Leaving aside unnecessary and probably ill-advised generalizations, I think it is, justified to say, also based on the work of ethnographic researchers, that there's a spiritual and religious connection of those people to nature, and in that case, particularly forests in this create. And what is particularly troubling against this backdrop probably is that it has been frequently pointed out also in the sources where I drew these pictures, or I got those pictures from, that Maasai and their traditional lifestyle have to face significant risks vis-a-vis the consequences of climate change that are definitely not comparable to any of the risks that people in the global north need to face. So I'm getting to the second point, so to the question, what is justice? The point of departure in much of canonical Western moral philosophy or ethics is basically the individual, its duties, rights, and obligations or responsibility. And I think it's interesting to contrast this with the communal nature of many African cultures, explicitly using the plural form. Ethics are social norms. And I brought one example where Oruka, Henrietta Oruka, a Kenyan philosopher, interviewed a member of the Lulu community. And here, Swearing was particularly spoke to me also against the backdrop of my experiences living actually in and with a Lulu family. Now, the sense in which we may justly say that the Lulu in the traditional setting practiced communalism is not one in which people generously share property or wealth. The idea of communalism is, I think, of a cooperative nature. For example, where one person has cattle, everybody ipso facto had cattle. For the owner of the cattle would distribute this cattle among people who did not have cattle. So the less well-off people may take care of them, but never completely give them away. And the result is that at the end of the day, everybody had cows to look after and so milk to drink. So this notion that Oruka here cites, and he also points to that in his work, resonates with Ubuntu philosophy, so this notion that I am because we are. And he suggests that individualistic ontologies that are often the backdrop of Western moral philosophy and ethics, also when it comes to conceptualizing justice, are actually not a good fit for conceptualizing justice and climate justice in many sub-Saharan African contexts and communities. In a similar way, Toyin Falola actually highlights the communal nature of Yoruba people's culture, as visualized in the painting here on the right. So here outlines that the crucial thing is that one person carries this drum and the other one is using it, and that's sort of a symbol among the Yoruba people in Nigeria for the high value of community and as a pillar of society and society's functioning. So the next and maybe a bit more humorous step to think about justice through African eyes is here based on actually a cartoon exhibition of a by now dear friend of mine who organized that at the Kenyan National Theatre back then. Seeing Justice Through African Eyes was actually the title. And what became particularly prominent in diverse cartoons, I hope you can see at least the signatures, so be too many cartoonists to enumerate all of them here, but diverse cartoons from diverse countries in sub-Saharan Africa, was that thinking about justice, or for thinking about justice, a very crucial point among people there is a critical reflection vis-a-vis the post-colonialism, post-colonialism, and its legacy of continuing oppression and poverty on the continent, and a critical view on global justice from an African viewpoint is here visualized in a satirical style. So cartoons are, to quote Toyin Falola, used as a corrective tool. Ridicule, irony, and humor are major corrective devices among various African communities that hold cultural codes, moral virtues, and spiritual uprightness in high esteem. And I think this exhibition that I just mentioned, Justice Through African Eyes, followed precisely this logic and also used laughter as a subversive tool that made people rethink established notions of justice and fairness that, there's a good chance that they have been at least partially imposed by westernized and post-colonial structures, the syllabus at universities and the schools that are still used, and the readings that are considered to be superior or canonical. And I think here, thinking about justice through African eyes works particularly well with these cartoons and tools as a subversive tool, because it makes us reflect upon these established notions, but in a humorous way that is not necessarily offensive to us or anyone else. Seeing climate justice through African eyes, I'm basically showing 3 cartoons here that Stini Ngare kindly selected for me from the Kenyan context. I think, the first big cartoon here on the left is already quite speaking. So at last, the rain season is now here, and what it's raining are actually not good things, but sort of the impacts of climate change, and the question, okay, what are we going to do now with this? And the pictures on the right, the one below, GMO for sale, I really enjoyed that one. So asking the question, how exactly did we get here to this point? Warranting food security often comes with a high cost, and that's something this Kenyan cartoonist also points out here. I said in the basically methodological outline of my talk that ground normative theorizing cannot just refer to, interviews and ethnographic research, artwork and exchanges about experiences, but also needs to have a feedback loop to, theory in the standard sense of the term, to conceptual notions, integrate lived experiences there. And I here proposed an exemplary feedback loop, one of the many that I did and still have to do, to African philosophers or theorists' accounts of environmental or climate justice. So first, to get to the status of nature and moral theory and ethics, when you look back, I try to see and envision, at least from a preliminary point of view, the relationship between human and non-human nature. So now when we have a look at accounts of the status of nature and moral theory and ethics in African philosophies, So one would be that the moral status of nature is actually highlighted by, for example, Remuru. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. This is quite recent work. He published the monograph in 2022, I think, an edited volume that in 2019. And he argues that not merely human beings, but also the environment or nature ought to be granted a moral status, and that human beings, and this is the interesting point, who are usually considered as those entities or beings that have something like a moral status and associated with that rights and responsibilities and so on, that human beings have duties towards nature because of their capacity to act rationally. And this obviously begs the question if we, whoever that may be, but human beings, and particularly probably industrialized societies, are currently doing justice to that duty towards nature. Another concept that I found particularly interesting is Mbur's eco-humanism, where he basically starts out from, also building on Oruka's work, starts out from a human minimum and argues that this human minimum that is necessary to survive and live a good life requires unity with the non-human world, and that this leads to radical requests for change. And that would be, on the one hand, a global redistribution of world resources, and on the other hand, taking care of the environment upon which we depend to satisfy our needs. So human rights are the other way around. The human minimum and human rights are important, but the point of departure here is not to start out from human rights, but to start out from climate justice and from understandings of nature, and then to argue that climate justice is actually a crucial part of or a crucial element to fulfill basic human rights, but that this requires radical political change. Based on interviews, for example, with indigenous women, Robinson's manifesto then conceptualizes climate justice as a human rights issue, that's also what I just pointed to. And Henry Oruka Dara's sage philosophy and also further philosophical work and practical philosophy, moral philosophy, defend the right to the human minimum that I just mentioned with regards to eco-humanism. He argues the basic human need, or the basic human needs, are those of physical security, subsistence, and also of health. He enumerates them, and also argues that the preconditions for global justice and a guarantee of human rights are actually to be met only when we take care of the environment. What is furthermore a very interesting feature is that communal conceptions of justice are prevailing also in at least the accounts of African philosophers that I read, not all of them, but the overwhelming amount employs a much more communal notion of justice, doesn't depart necessarily from the individual to the extent that many global North or Western philosophies do. And one point of departure for Mburu, for example, is to consider natural rights as something that is needs-based and not liberty-based, and that also refers implies a critical assessment of, for example, John Locke's philosophy, where he starts out from the individual and its liberties, and not so much from communities and their needs that need to be fulfilled. And that can only be fulfilled. So the argument goes in the case of Mburu, in the case of Oruka, and also in the case of Remuru. These needs can only be fulfilled if we develop another perspective on nature, on this moral status of nature, and consider, consider maybe, and I think that's a very interesting and important point of departure also for further conceptualizations and thought, consider human and non-human beings as a unity, as a family unity in Baruka's terms. So I'm very briefly gonna get to my third claim to not unduly go over time. And the third claim is that climate change vulnerability is actually a dimension for intersectional research in social sciences that can be very fruitful, particularly against the backdrop of the current climate emergency. The classical definition of intersectionality would be to consider it as a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that often are not understood among conventional ways of thinking. So it's about these intersecting dimensions of that cause oppression and inequality. Usually intersectionality research is deeply rooted in social movements and Black feminism, for example, and in decolonial, post-colonial movements, and also consecutive studies. And against this backdrop, it becomes clear that it's on the one hand a normative theoretical approach, and on the other hand also an activist approach, or at least provides foundations for an activist approach, such that the aforementioned close or more intimate relationship between activists and researchers with regards to these topics may actually make a lot of sense. The core goal here is to consider intersectionality from Hancock's perspective as a path-breaking analytical framework for understanding questions of inequality and injustice. And I am arguing here that climate change vulnerability has so far mainly been understood as a result of those intersection dimensions of oppression. So, for example, your location on the globe, your ethnicity or nationality, and more or less attached to that in most cases, your gender, sexuality, your race, and so on. But I think based on the elaborations that I outlined, and also based on, just the empirical context that we're facing nowadays. So this empirical context where we are facing a climate emergency and at the same time are confronted with significant obstacles to consequential political action. Against this backdrop, we can use, and this would be my proposal, climate change vulnerability as another dimension of intersectionality, as a dimension that we can use as a fruitful analytical tool to understand the dynamics and the political and social economic inequalities vis-a-vis the climate emergency, and also with regards to analyzing political and social processes when it comes to facing this emergency and counteracting or mitigating its consequences. So to provide you with a brief wrap-up and for the account of climate justice through African eyes, and for what I think at least I learned, and I'm curious about your feedback afterwards. So my first claim would be to avoid biased perspectives that are usually based on the Western and global North philosophy and concepts. Accounts of climate justice must be grounded in affected communities' experiences. Secondly, any attempt at grounding these approaches reveals that lived experience, as conveyed, for example, in art and narratives and interviews, allows fresh perspectives on A, the relationship between human and non-human nature, and B, understandings of justice, just to feature one core aspect for each of them with regards to the relationship human, non-human nature, particularly this notion of a unity between family unity of human and non-human nature. This metaphor spoke to me, and I think can speak to a lot of theorists and philosophers when we take this notion seriously. And with regards to justice, particularly grounding understandings of justice in more communal ontologies and notions, is an idea that is worth pursuing against the backdrop of, the cited work, but also the encounters with different people whom I met and had the pleasure to talk to, and with regards to visualizations that we saw, like artwork that we saw. Third, conceptualizing climate change vulnerability as a dimension of intersectionality can provide us with a future analytical background for social science scholarship and also for political practice in consequence, that does justice to the climate change emergency and to global structural injustices, and maybe incorporates those two things in a more comprehensive manner. So what can we learn from this for, well, sub-Saharan Africa, but also beyond when it comes to theorizing about climate change? One thing that, on top of the things that I mentioned before, was particularly interesting to me was the opportunity to rethink understandings of progress and the goals of development politics against the backdrop of these considerations. So considerations about climate justice through African eyes allow for scrutiny, on the one hand, of the legacy of European Enlightenment, philosophy, and diverse markers of progress. So the Industrial Revolution, industrialization of societies, and so on. So this myth of eternal growth that Greta Thunberg, for example, pointed to. So reconceptualizing those elements would actually be, at least from my viewpoint, a very helpful tool and attempt to maybe make some progress also in global North Western societies. So before I thank you all for your attention and dig into the Q&A, I want to say or give my special thanks to many people. So I highlighted that theorizing is a collaborative project. So before I conclude all of this, special thanks to Toyin Falola, whom I met in Nairobi, Humphrey Jeremiah Irvang, Steve Gore, Jerry Kinuta, who offered to one of her paintings for this presentation, Marisa Mutabi, Jackson Coy and his family, so his daughter, Kenneth is actually the best Swahili teacher that I ever met, although I'm still not very good at this. Amazing students in Tanzania and Kenya, and many more people. And thank you very much for your attention. All questions and comments are certainly warmly welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fleuss, for your presentation. Now, if you want to ask a question, so you can raise your hand and be allowed to speak, or you can type it in the Q&A section. So those are the ways of participating in the discussion. And I see that Johnny Musumbu raised their hand, so I'm going to let them speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. So I think that theorizing in the field that we have chosen is very daunting. And somewhere in your presentation, you talk about don't ask philosophers, ask people directly in the process. But I would like to maybe point out that in Africa, we have also a way of philosophizing about nature, about ontology, and the best one is the Ubuntu vision of that. So that might be a starting point to see how Africans, sub-Saharan, see the world, what is reality, how do you actually approach it. And also, I think theorizing in this field is a kind of, I agree with you when you talk about feedback, which is very important. in a sense that most of the things that happened are the result of interactions of different things. So how do you actually go through all this process to make sense of it in order to come up with some kind of, element that you are going to connect so that you come up with the theory?
Okay, so I think there's one comment and one question when I got this right. Am I supposed to respond directly, or are you?
Yeah, go ahead. You can respond directly. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, thank you for the comment also referring to Ubuntu philosophy. I definitely agree with you on this. The book chapter that I'm currently working on has a way longer section on Ubuntu philosophy, for example, or in different African accounts. I briefly mentioned a few of them here. So I think it's very important, on the one hand, with regards to this topic, to take these philosophical considerations into account. I wanted to start out from lived experiences that are not theorized or highly theorized yet. So I really wanted to start out from perspectives of so-called ordinary people, or more or less ordinary people, who convey lived experiences in different ways. I think there are two aspects here to keep in mind. One would be that, Western global North theorists and philosophers often pretend that there is no such thing as, African philosophy, or truly African philosophy, or don't even integrate that, for example, in their syllabus and in their reading lists. I think that's a huge mistake to start with. But another mistake, and I think that's applicable in most contexts, would be, from my viewpoint at least, and from the viewpoint, the methodological viewpoint on political theory that I'm defending, another mistake would be to start out from the academic ivory tower, to start in the beginning, because usually in most countries and contexts and on all continents, those people who sit, it's actually not an ivory tower, but almost on the ground floor, but who sit in offices in universities and so on, are already among highly privileged people, or among groups of highly privileged people. So for me, it is important to sort of, maybe have lived experiences of non-academics as a point of departure. And then integrate, for certainly also African political theory and thought. And I pointed towards Ubuntu, I pointed towards the sage philosophy of Dar, and a couple of other rather eclectic constellations of philosophers that I thought maybe speaking to this point here. When you ask me how am I going through this process, I can only speak for myself. As I said, it's a recursive process. You usually have something like a preconception of what justice, for example, means. Most people have, at least intuitively. You don't have to be a philosopher or a theorist to have a preconception or a basic understanding of what that may mean for you. And then I'm basically asking questions. Trying to immerse more or less into the experiences of other people. That doesn't have to be sub-Saharan African people, but this was one context where I lived and worked for quite a while, and where I was the stranger and needed to understand this through various media and in various ways. And I basically, like at a personal level, I think at the end of the day, you can only describe that as a personal level, came to this context with some preconceptions, with some readings also of African philosophy, was teaching there, was living there, made various experiences that were sometimes unsettling, sometimes disturbing, but these were often these disruptive or unsettling experiences were sometimes the most productive experiences. And then I spoke with colleagues who are also, in the field, who are political theorists or philosophers or social scientists, and had this feedback loop in conversations with them, but then also reread, basically, philosophical or theoretical accounts on justice, on emancipation, and different notions to couple to feedback this and to integrate lived experiences and what I made of it into these theoretical notions, and provide a more comprehensive and inclusive account. And then you basically go back to the fields and test your approaches and accounts against this backdrop. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. And Solomon? Solomon, you can go ahead and ask your question. Solomon, did you raise your hand to ask a question? Okay, I think maybe not. So you can look at the questions in the Q&A and see if you...
Sorry, I didn't have that open.
Okay. Is it okay now?
Yes, we can.
Are you hearing me? Very good. Thank you. I am from Uganda, a university lecturer and a writer. I'm becoming a philosopher because I have a coin in neo-complexity philosophy, and I relate it to climate change. First of all, Doctor talked about Kisoko. I come from Kisoko. I know the area so well and the problems of climate change that is affecting the people in the area. But when we look at the theorizing and philosophizing about this climate change and the rest of human life, I believe that there is something we are living as a gap. Humanity has got three elements that interpenetrate. In fact, humankind lives as a third of reality. There is the physical presence of human beings, including plants and animals and non-living things, that is physically seen. And then there is the spiritual reality, which interpenetrate human beings and even the trees and plants. Then there are intelligible realities. So when you look at the African stool, one leg stands for the physical reality, the other leg spiritual reality, and then the third intelligible realities, and they interpenetrate. We could talk of the intelligible realities as within the cosmos. So most philosophies from Western countries concentrate on the physical and ignore the spiritual and the intelligible. The intelligible realities are those that we know exist, but we do not know where and how they exist, but they have significant influence in our lives, in the universe. What am I saying? I'm saying that we need to integrate the education system to include all of these three realities. In Uganda, from the Jaluo, part of the Kenyan Luo, we believe that there are political trees and there are sacred trees. When a tree becomes political, it is preserved. For example, the people who moved from Middle East and settled here found certain trees, and our founder preserved that tree, and that tree is sacred and it is never cut down. It is believed that it has got some magic powers. By believing like that, we are preserving the environment. Then we also have the element of animals. We humanize the animals, we humanize the trees, we humanize the environment. In this case, when you keep your cow or chicken for a long time in the home, you don't slaughter and eat. It becomes part of the family. And therefore, you rather sell, it is slaughtered in the butchery, and then you can buy a kilo of meat somewhere, because you cannot eat part of the human family. So all of these have got implications concerning preservation of the environment. And therefore, I would like to propose, as Dr. said, we needed to make more research, investigate how we understand the environment through the human eye. In Kisoko, where Constance was interviewed, there is a gentleman who is known to make rain. Actually, if you find him, he can manipulate his magic, and the rain can, hailstorm can come and torture a particular area of that village, or even away from that village. He has the power, in fact, he's known, he has the power to manipulate nature for his benefit or for the benefit of other people, or even the torture of other people. So in African situation, we needed to congregate all of these beliefs. We need to write a kind of ethnographic research so that we can understand the way Africans conceptualize. Let me give you another example. An African who has not gone to school is a very good geographer. How? They know when rains will come, they read the signs from the sky. When the moon is rising, the new moon is going to be to rise, they prepare their gardens because they know the appearance of the first moon and the appearance of the new moon will bring rain. And when the moon is mature, nobody plants. When the sky is red, they know hailstorm is coming. And when the trees are beginning to shed leaves, they know dry season is coming. Look at that kind of knowledge. The indigenous knowledge of the African setting should be incorporated in understanding our environment and especially our earth. The earth is one and there is no substitute. So, Doctor, I have a lot to say, but let me stop there. I hope you have picked some points. And thank you, the audience, and Dr. the researcher. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really liked your emphasis also on the value with regards to, well, understanding the environment and climate change. Your emphasis of indigenous knowledge and knowledge of so-called ordinary people. I actually never know what to do with this term. It's just an established term in much of social science research, but I think I'm very much an ordinary person myself. But well, so-called ordinary peoples and indigenous peoples' wisdom and knowledge is crucial, I think. On the one hand, when we want to conceptualize or understand climate justice or any other theoretical notion in a context-sensitive manner, but also when we want to, well, do this in a less paternalistic and exclusive manner and value those traditions that have not been written down yet. So I think what you just elaborated on, correct me if I'm mistaken, but I am like a true admirer of Aruka's work on sage philosophy. And he interviewed local sages. Can be critical of the concept of sages, but at the end of the day, I think he did a lot of those things, or laid out a lot of paths that ethnographic researchers who are interested in philosophy, or philosophers who want to integrate ethnographic research can follow, to also integrate oral traditions and to counteract this notion that there is no such thing as generally African philosophy on this or that topic. There is, in most cases, you probably have to ask people and try to pick up on traditions of conveying knowledge that are not those of standardized Western formats, so in books and journal articles, newspapers, and so on. So love the emphasis on that. Thank you.
Thank you too.
There are two questions in the chat. Ronnie Muzumbu, that is one of the reasons to decolonize knowledge and methodological thinking. I think we captured. Is this a question or was this a comment?
I think it's a comment. Yeah,
Okay.
it's the first participant. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if you had anything to say for this other question. I'm not sure.
Well, I think I already said quite a couple of things about reasons for decolonizing knowledge and theorizing. From my viewpoint, I actually prefer the term indigenizing to decolonizing, because decolonizing often implies that you take colonialism away or something like that, at least in the way the word is constructed. I think that's probably not possible, but embracing the knowledge of indigenous communities and integrating that into theory is crucial from my viewpoint. I'm not sure what reason you were referring to, but for me, it's essentially also a question of, generally democratic and inclusive theorizing. So I would describe myself as a democratic theorist, as an egalitarian democratic theorist. And that also means that I have to respect that in methodological terms. So I cannot just sit in my philosophical armchair or academic ivory tower and look at the world outside and theorize about that in an abstract manner. But it also implies that I, from a global north perspective, have to at least try to understand and make sense of understandings and conceptions of people on other parts of the globe. Then there's James Blessing. In terms of future water shortage in Australia by 2050, what are perspectives on mitigation via the IPCC approach? Well, I'm reading the IPCC reports, but to be honest, I would have to look that up for concrete policy measures in Australia. With regards to water shortage, so I don't want to bullshit anyone here and say, okay, these are like abstract measures. I think we know about them, but in terms of concrete measures, policy measures for Australia for water shortage, I would have to give you a pass here. Unfortunately, I have to look it up, and you can email me. Then an anonymous attendee is asking, why is decolonizing impossible? It is inevitable to have Europeans controlling Africa. I didn't want to say that decolonizing is impossible. I hope I didn't do that. I think my main concern, or the only concern, I think it's crucial to engage in this process politically and also, from an academic perspective. The only concern that I had was about the term decolonizing, because it is this, we're engaging there, in, at least like when you take the word, when you take this literally, the process to take, where you want to take away the colonial experience or colonial experiences and the aftermath of colonialism and post-colonialism. And I think getting rid of all of these structures is really, really hard. You basically cannot do this. You also have to decolonize minds. You have to decolonize the curriculum. So you won't get rid of all of history, basically. It happened, unfortunately. It happened. And I mean, right now I'm more or less by accident living in a country that has also been colonized by the UK for a while, so in the Republic of Ireland. But I've been living in several countries, and I hold a passport from a country that was sadly among the colonizers. So I don't say it's something like we should appreciate what happened. I'm just saying getting rid of history is probably not possible, and that's why I prefer, personally at least, the term indigenizing theory or indigenizing knowledge. So bringing indigenous perspectives back in instead of decolonizing, getting rid of history and the legacy of colonialism.
Thank you. Emmanuel raised her hand, so let's see. Can you unmute? Emmanuel, can you unmute and speak? Try unmuting, Emmanuel. Oh, well, it's not. Can you unmute now? Okay, I don't know what's happening. It's not. Okay, let's see if it's date. Oh, that's another one. I mean, does decolonizing mean getting rid of history?
Is there another? Sorry. There's also a hand up. Okay.
No.
The question here in the chat, does decolonizing mean getting rid of history? So basically, I just have a terminological concern about the term decolonizing, because this de and colonizing sort of, at least for me, appears like an attempt to take colonialism away, or the impacts and legacy of colonialism away from a particular context, or from a particular kind of theorizing and so on. So, and I actually think that this is not possible, but I'm not dismissing the general attempt to decolonize or indigenize, or however you want to frame it. Well, theory, political processes, countries, the curriculum at universities and the schools. So that's not my concern at all.
We're almost at 1:30, so really thank you for coming and sharing your research with us, Dr. Fleuss. We really appreciate it. And I thank the audience for coming and getting engaged and asking questions. We'll see everybody next week. If possible, please join us for another Eye on Africa. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.